As a composer, one of the questions that I get asked is, what is the continued role of art in a time of climate crisis? And my answer to that question is that what art can do is it can widen our attention, and it can refocus our perspective in such a way to create empathy and to lead to new ideas that may help us to reach long-term solutions to some of these problems. And I think that this is particularly important for those of us who are in urban environments, because one of the things that we do is we create invisible and artificial psychological boundaries around the city that we live in, as compared to the idea of pristine nature outside of that city. We have an emphasis on this idea of the perfect tree in the forest, to the point that we don't acknowledge the street tree outside of our own building. And this has the impact of siloing our attention, of making us consider what is worth preserving and what it is that we simply don't see. This act of not seeing has a name. It's called plant blindness. And this is the simple fact that for most of us, we tend to see the plants outside of our buildings as this sort of impenetrable green mass, not distinguishable as individuals, and certainly not distinguishable as non-human intelligences. So, one of the things that's important for us in cities is to recognize the fact that we are part of the forest canopy. It extends through the city, and it is not contained by these boundaries that we place upon it. This is particularly important because the urban forest does have a role to play in mitigating the worst effects of climate change, including lessening the impact of heat islands, of increasing the amount of breathable air that we have, and of providing habitat for the fauna that live in the city with us. So, in order to take on the responsibility of preserving these things, it's important for us to widen our attention to include them in the idea of what is worth preserving. And this is where art can play a role. And that, at its most fundamental, what an artist is doing is sharing a different perspective on the world. When you go to see a play or a movie, when you take in a painting, what you're doing is you're allowing yourself for a moment to see the world as that artist saw it. And hopefully, what this will do for you is to shift your own perspective. Now, I'm someone that works in opera and in theater, and I went into these things because it's important for me to tell stories, with the idea that telling stories of people who are not always seen will put us into their shoes for a little bit and will give us empathy for them. I've done this in a lot of my previous work, including Thumbprint, which is an opera about the Pakistani education activist Mukhtar Mai, in Looking at You, which is an opera about AI, algorithmic weaponization, and surveillance capitalism, where the audience's social media posts are data mined and put into the projection design of the show. It's a little terrifying. So the point of all of this is, can we step inside this perspective, and will it shift the way that we think about the most pressing problems facing us as modern audiences? Recently, I have started to apply this practice to the non-human intelligences that make up the natural world. If we can also find empathy and take the perspective of that tree in the forest, will this allow us to consider it also as worthy of preserving, our street trees as well as our forest trees? And so, I believe that art, particularly as applied to these issues, can create our empathy and can lead us to greater action. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share a few examples of pieces that I've made recently that deal with this way of thinking about the climate crisis. The first is called The Last Stand. I love a pun. And this was an opera created for the trees of Prospect Park in collaboration with the Foundation Creative Time. I made this piece after talking to dozens of tree researchers, including Dr. Suzanne Simard and Dr. Monica Galliano. I asked them the same question. What would music for a tree sound like? And the answer that they gave me is the sound of a healthy forest, because a tree is not an individual. Instead, its mycorrhizal networks communicate with the trees around it, allowing them to share resources. And so, as a community, they can stand together. And that is what led to the way that I made this piece. It is a 10-hour opera created from field recordings of the Black Rock Forest, so frogs, birds, the sounds of the forest. And each 2 minutes of sound in the piece correspond to 1 year of the tree's life, a 300-year-old tree, therefore 10 hours. People were invited to come in and out of this installation as they liked. It was up for a month in Prospect Park in the fall of 2021, and over 6,000 people visited. So I'm going to play you a little bit of this piece, and then I'm going to show you some of the things that people said after they experienced being inside the installation.
I got this. So yeah, I want you to calm down.
What you're hearing are birds and frogs recorded from inside the forest. All I did was line them up and layer them on top of each other so that you can hear the natural music that emerges. And I love the dog. We had a lot of dogs visit. These are some of the things that people said after they came to the installation. That I didn't realize how long I was inside of it. I lost track of time. I heard the world differently after I left. I noticed the birds more, or the airplanes that I had been blocking out. Suddenly, I heard them. So being inside of this and letting yourself have this moment of sustained attention then changes the way that you attend to the world when you leave. I found the same thing with a piece that I made for the Brooklyn Botanic Garden while I was artist in residence there last summer. And this piece was specifically commissioned to be a response to the trees in the garden. So I talked to all of the horticulturists who lived there, the arborists, and I chose a selection of 5 trees to respond to. And this piece, I wanted to sort of capture my feeling of what this tree was like. This piece is written for traditionally notated a cappella voices, and yet it has a similar impact in that by making the tree the subject of the piece, it changes the way that you think about that tree. So I'm going to play you an excerpt about the Magnolia Ave Maria, which was created by one of the women scientists who used to work at the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens research garden, and it has one of the first yellow cultivars of the flowers.
To bring forth yellow, cause you love the cucumber tree. To bring forth yellow, cause you love the cucumber tree. Yellow, yellow. Here, 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 here.
So once more, simply making this tree, this thing that we might walk past, the subject of a piece of art, changes not only how we think about that tree, but also the other trees that might be in our life. For example, one of the audience members at a recent concert said, this made me think about our own macerated beech tree in the backyard, and I wish that other people looked at it the same way. So the last one I want to share with you is actually in Riverdale, and this is a piece that was commissioned by City's Living Laboratory to respond to the daylighting of Tibbetts Brook down in Van Cortlandt Park. As you may know, Tibbetts used to run from Yonkers all the way to the former site of the Spuyten Duyvil Creek. In the 1920s, it was sent into the sewer system by the Army Corps of Engineers, and that is part of why the Deegan floods in catastrophic rains, because there was a lot of fresh water that doesn't belong there. So the daylighting is the process of bringing it back above ground, and this piece was commissioned to connect us, the neighborhood, back to the historical topography of the land. So the way that it works is it's an augmented reality app. It uses the geolocation data from your phone to turn music loops on and off. So the way that you walk, how fast you walk, that changes the experience that you have. The sound that you'll hear is hydrophone recordings, which is an underwater microphone that I made with people from the community in the park. You'll also hear the centerpiece of the app experience, which is a song in Munsee offered by Nicole Pecor of the Mohegan-Munsee Nation, because Riverdale was at one point part of Lenape-Hoking, the Lenape territory that extended all the way down to Delaware, and they are also part of our history. So what you're going to see is an app walkthrough, which is a mock-up of what you would see on your phone as you were walking. The little T is the geographical marker of where you would be on the path.
This is the river.
So as you can see, one of the things about the historic path of the brook is that it used to go from the park across what is now Broadway into the urban part of the neighborhood. And this is one of the most exciting things for me that people who have experienced this have said, is I always thought about the boundary between the park and across Broadway, but really it's all connected. And that's the point, is that we are part of nature. There is no boundary between us in the city and the forest. And I would like to leave you then with this additional thought from the environmental historian William Cronin, that part of what we are doing is trying to widen our attention to include both the street tree and the forest tree, that we can discover a common middle ground in which all of these things, from the city to the wilderness, can be encompassed in the one word, home. Thank you.